We're now joined by IEC CEO Mamabolo. Good evening to you, Mr. Mamabolo. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the late edition on SABC News.
Good evening and greetings to viewers.
Now, the IEC told Parliament that the introduction of the new electoral system during last year's elections was seamless. Can you take us through what specific reforms were introduced and how were they implemented operationally?
The major reform that was undertaken ahead of last year's election was the introduction of independent candidates. In the end, 11 of them contested the elections. But there was also the introduction of a third ballot. In other words, the regional representation of provinces in the National Assembly. That component was contested, if you like, as a separate election on which independent candidates were accommodated. Now, operationally, that meant that our candidate nomination system had to be enhanced, whereas our result system, where we capture the results of the elections, had to be done anew. So those are some of the implications that we have had to deal with. Naturally, of course, it included training of our staff, retraining of our staff to ensure that they understood the new framework. And lastly, the public education, voter education around the three ballots. Every voter needed to understand how the three ballots are going to work and how they relate to the composition of both the National Assembly as well as the provincial legislature.
Now, despite all those complexities that you've just outlined, you've also highlighted that voter registration reached 27.78 million, which is by far the highest since democracy. So what factors do you believe contributed to this significant milestone?
Certainly, we have to laud the effort of political parties in that regard, mobilizing their own supporters for registration. The second factor is the online voter registration portal, which is more attractive to younger persons. So I think going forward, we need to invest a bit more to market that portal to ensure that we capture as many young people as possible, even now, well ahead of the next phase of elections.
Yeah. And some critics, Mr. Mamabolo, also argue that while the new system allows independent candidates, it remains biased towards political parties. So how do you respond to concerns about the true inclusivity and the fairness under the current reforms?
Remember, one of the things that we think we achieved in the last iteration of the amendment of the Electoral Act was to make provision for an electoral reform panel, which will comprehensively look at those reforms that may be necessary in the election of the National Assembly and the provincial legislatures going forward. That panel was constituted in May last year. It had a period of consultation, it had an international conference, and now it's in the process of finalizing their report. We hope that when that report is tabled, it will speak to some of those criticisms that have been leveled.
And do the new electoral amendments have any unintended consequences in terms of the ballot design, voter confusion, or even vote counting processes?
Not at all, except that voting took longer than was the case previously, such as in 2019. But that was to be expected because we were increasing the volume of ballots by a 50% factor. What did present challenge, though, is the Section 24A. In other words, that facility to vote outside of the voting district in which you are registered. It's an amendment that Parliament made in 2021, but it became clear that despite the communication that was given, despite the information that people had, in the 2-3 weeks before the election, there was almost a clamoring of people saying we need to have this facility reintroduced. Now, you can't amend legislation in 2-3 weeks. So this is a matter that Parliament has considered, has committed to consider together with us in the future.
Yeah. And let's now talk about the role that technology played in ensuring the seamless conduct of the elections and how the IEC, is safeguarding its systems against cyber threats and misinformation campaigns.
Look, any modern program of the scale which an election is has got to have some safeguards because cyber crimes abound, and we need some protection, which is why we undertake certain security audits ahead of an election to ensure that where there may be shortcomings, those are addressed in the lead up to the election. But this is an area in which we'll forever need to make good investment so that our ICT infrastructure is not compromised. It's an evolving area. Today's cyber attack is different from what the cyber attack will be tomorrow. So it needs continuous investment for us to remain really on the cutting edge of counter cyber attack measures.
All right, Mr. Mamabolo, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.